Hello, welcome, and thank you for joining me tonight. I am Joan, and tonight we are going to step into the road that led away from Jerusalem in the fading light, the road to a village called Emmaus, where two followers of Jesus carried the weight of a story they thought had ended. It was late in the day, the kind of hour when the sun lowers behind the western hills and the stones of the road hold the last warmth of afternoon. Behind them stood the holy city, crowded after the Passover, restless with rumor, and marked by a death that had shaken their hearts more deeply than they yet understood. Ahead of them lay a small village, a familiar path and the first shadows of evening. But somewhere between the city and the village, between grief and understanding, a quiet mystery would begin to unfold. Hope was already near them. They simply did not recognize his face. The city of Jerusalem did not empty all at once after the feast. It loosened slowly, like a tightly held cord slipping through tired hands. Families gathered their bundles. Pilgrims counted children, animals, bread, and water skins. Merchants folded dyed cloth beneath awnings. Priests moved through the temple courts with practiced purpose. Soldiers watched from their posts, their eyes trained on streets where celebration and unrest could change places quickly. The air still carried the smells of sacrifice, smoke, dust, oil, sweat, and unleavened bread. Songs that had risen during the feast now lingered only in fragments, a line half remembered. A melody hummed under someone's breath as travelers turned toward home. Yet for the followers of Jesus of Nazareth, the city had become something else. Its gates and courtyards, its stone steps and narrow lanes had become witnesses. Here he had taught. Here he had been welcomed by some and opposed by others. Here the crowd had shifted like wind across dry grass. Here the rulers had condemned him. Here Roman hands had fastened him to wood outside the walls. And here, only days later, whispers had begun to move through the rooms where his disciples hid and wondered what remained of all they had believed. Two of them were leaving that afternoon. One was named Cleopas. The other is not named in the Gospel, and because Scripture leaves that place unfilled, we may walk beside them without forcing more than has been given. They were disciples, though not among the 12. They had listened, followed, hoped, questioned, and loved. They had known enough of Jesus to feel that his death was not only a loss but a collapse of meaning. They had likely seen the roads fill when he entered Jerusalem. They had heard how people spoke of him, some with longing, some with suspicion, some with guarded wonder. They had believed, in a way they could hardly explain now, that he might be the one to redeem Israel. But the hill called Golgotha had seemed to crush that hope. They passed through the outskirts of the city with the slow gait of people who are not eager to arrive anywhere. Their sandals brushed the pale dust. Their cloaks, travel-worn and simple, moved lightly in the cooling air. They did not walk with the rhythm of merchants eager for business, nor with the relieved laughter of pilgrims returning after worship. Their steps were burdened by memory. Every sound behind them seemed tied to the city they were leaving. The creak of a gate, the call of a vendor, the distant bleating of an animal, the murmur of strangers speaking in low tones about events no one fully understood. The road to Emmaus stretched about 7 miles from Jerusalem. It moved through the hill country of Judea, where the land rose and dipped in uneven folds. Stone walls marked small plots of earth. Olive trees twisted out of the soil, their trunks old and gnarled, their leaves silvering when touched by the wind. Dry grasses caught the amber light. Fig trees stood near terraces. The path itself was not wide or grand, but it was known. People had walked it many times: villagers, pilgrims, traders, family members, men carrying news, women carrying grain, children running ahead until called back by weary parents. On this afternoon, the road seemed to hold more silence than usual. The two disciples spoke as they walked. At times, their conversation may have quickened, one voice rising with emotion, then dropping again as if remembering exhaustion. At other moments, they may have fallen into long gaps where only footsteps answered footsteps. They were discussing all that had happened, not merely recalling events, but turning them over and over, searching for a shape within them. There are some sorrows that do not remain still in the mind. They circle, they return, they press the same questions into the heart until the person carrying them becomes tired of his own thoughts and yet cannot set them down. Jesus had been a prophet mighty in deed and word before God and all the people. That much they knew. They had seen or heard enough to speak of his power honestly. The blind had received sight. The lame had walked. Lepers had been cleansed. The poor had heard good news. Demons had fled at his command. Sinners had found mercy in his presence without pretending their sin was light. He spoke of the kingdom of God as though it were not an idea floating far away, but a reality breaking into the world through him. His words had a weight unlike the teachers they had known, and yet a tenderness that drew the wounded near. How could such a one be handed over? How could the chief priests and rulers deliver him to be condemned? How could Rome, with its iron authority and indifferent cruelty, be allowed to nail him to a cross? These questions did not come as calm theological puzzles. They came with faces, sounds, and images. A courtyard, an accusation. A crowd, the scrape of wood. The public shame, the long hours, the sky darkening, the final cry. The lifeless body taken down, the tomb sealed. The Sabbath passing over a stunned and scattered people. And then there were the women. This was part of what troubled them most, because grief had already been heavy enough before astonishment was added to it. Some women from their company had gone early to the tomb. They had carried spices in devotion, expecting to honor the body of the Lord. They had gone when the morning was young, before the day had fully opened while the city was not yet loud. But they returned with words that did not fit ordinary sorrow. The stone was moved. The body was not there. They had seen a vision of angels who said that he was alive. Alive. The word must have sounded almost too bright to hold. Others had gone to the tomb and found it as the women had said, but him they did not see. This was the strange wound inside the report. The tomb was empty, yes. The testimony of the women had not simply vanished under doubt. There were confirmations. There were details. There was enough to disturb every conclusion. But there was not yet the sight their hearts longed for. Not yet his voice calling their names. Not yet his hands extended before them. Not yet the impossible made plain. So they walked away from Jerusalem carrying both loss and rumor, both memory and unanswered promise. The late afternoon light poured across the road in long bands. The hills softened under gold. Shadows gathered beneath the olive trees and along the low stone borders. The air cooled by small degrees. Perhaps a bird crossed overhead, dark against the pale sky. Perhaps a shepherd in the distance guided his animals toward a fold before night. Perhaps smoke rose from a village fire somewhere ahead, thin and blue, barely visible against the descending evening. The world continued in its old patterns, even while the disciples felt that the center of their world had come undone. That is one of the strange mercies and pains of such moments. The road remains a road. Dust clings to sandals. Hunger comes at its hour. The sun lowers whether the heart understands or not. People pass carrying baskets, speaking of ordinary matters. But inside, a person may be standing before a sealed tomb, unable to leave it, even while his body walks away. Cleopas and his companion were not faithless in the simple sense. They were wounded believers. They were not mocking the reports of the women. They were not indifferent to Jesus. Their sadness showed how much they had hoped. Their confusion showed that they had listened to enough of his promise to be troubled by its apparent ruin. They had not yet abandoned the story. They were still speaking of him. They were still gathering every fragment. They were still trying to understand why redemption had looked so much like defeat. And before the evening was over, they would learn that their conversation had been heard. But for now, they only saw the road. The stones beneath their feet were uneven, some worn smooth by generations of travelers, others sharp at the edges where the path had broken under heat and rain. A dry wind moved lightly across the hillside, lifting dust around their ankles. Their garments were common for the time. Tunics belted for travel, outer cloaks drawn close when the air shifted, head coverings marked by the journey's dust. Their hands may have moved as they spoke, palms opening in bewilderment, fingers closing when pain tightened the thought. Their faces were drawn, not by theatrical despair, but by the kind of exhaustion that follows days of watching, waiting, fearing, and not sleeping well. Behind them, Jerusalem stood in layered stone, catching the last light. Its walls, from a distance, could look strong enough to hold certainty. But the disciples knew how many questions those walls now contained. Somewhere within or near that city were the remaining followers of Jesus, speaking in hushed tones. Somewhere Peter was bearing the memory of denial and the bewilderment of an empty tomb. Somewhere John carried what he had seen at the cross. Somewhere Mary Magdalene and the other women held their astonishing report like flame cupped against wind. The story was not quiet in Jerusalem. It trembled. Yet Cleopas and his companion had chosen the road to Emmaus. Why they were going, Scripture does not fully say. Perhaps Emmaus was home. Perhaps they had lodging there. Perhaps they needed to leave the place of pain for a few hours to move their bodies because their minds could not remain enclosed. Their departure was not necessarily rejection. It may have been simply human. When events become too heavy, people often walk. They take a road. They turn toward the familiar. They talk until words fail, then begin again. They leave behind the room where everyone's sorrow presses against everyone else's, hoping that distance will make the heart easier to carry. But there was a reason this road had grown important. It was not famous like Sinai, where thunder and fire had marked the mountain. It was not the Jordan, where Israel had crossed into promise. It was not Bethlehem, where shepherds once heard angelic praise. It was not the Sea of Galilee, where nets had been left and storms had been stilled. It was simply a road at evening, with two grieving disciples walking through the hills. And yet the risen Lord would choose it as the place where hidden truth began to warm cold hearts. For now, he remained unseen by them. The sun lowered further, and the colors of the land began to change. The gold deepened into copper along the stones. The olive leaves lost their flash of silver and became darker, quieter shapes against the slope. The sky near the horizon held a faint brightness, while above them the blue grew deeper. The sounds of the city thinned behind them. Ahead, the village of Emmaus waited somewhere beyond the folds of land, not yet fully visible, but close enough to be imagined. Lamps being prepared, doors opening, bread set near the hearth, families settling after the day. Still the disciples spoke. They spoke of Jesus as he had been before the arrest. They spoke of his words, perhaps trying to remember whether he had told them something they had missed. Had he not spoken of suffering? Had he not said that the Son of Man would be delivered up? Had he not hinted at rising again? But such words, when first heard, can pass through the mind like wind through branches. Only afterward, when events have taken place, does the heart begin to ask whether the meaning was there all along. They spoke of the third day. This too mattered. It was now the third day since these things had happened. The phrase carried tension. It was not merely a count of time. It suggested that something had been expected, or at least remembered. The third day had arrived, and instead of clarity, they had reports. Women, angels, an empty tomb, absent body, no visible Lord. The signs were gathered like pieces of a lamp, but no flame had yet seemed to catch. Their hope had not disappeared completely. It had become unrecognizable to them. And that is the quiet mystery at the beginning of this road. Hope does not always return first as certainty. Sometimes it comes near as a stranger. Sometimes it listens before it speaks. Sometimes it walks at the pace of those who are too tired to run toward joy. It does not force their eyes open at once. It lets them tell the story as they understand it, even when their understanding is incomplete. It draws out the ache, not to deepen the wound, but to reveal where healing must enter. The two disciples did not know this yet. They did not know that the one they mourned was not behind them in the tomb, but near them on the road. They did not know that the scriptures they had heard since childhood were about to be opened with a light no teacher had ever given them. They did not know that their sadness would become testimony by nightfall, or that the breaking of bread in an ordinary house would reveal what their eyes could not see on the path. All they knew was the length of the road, the fading of the day, and the unresolved ache of a promise they feared had failed. As they walked, another traveler drew near, not with spectacle, not with the sound of trumpets, not with a blaze in the sky or a command that shook the hills, just footsteps on the same road, approaching in the evening light. A man close enough to hear their conversation, a presence entering their sorrow without announcing himself. The two disciples continued on, and the stranger came alongside them. And in that simple joining of footsteps, the road to Emmaus began to change. The road bent slowly away from Jerusalem, descending through rough country where the stones held the day's warmth even as the air began to cool. Dust clung to the hems of the travelers' garments. Their sandals pressed familiar patterns into the path, one step after another, measured, reluctant, as if the body could move forward while the heart kept turning back toward the city behind them. The stranger walked beside them now. He did not hurry them. He did not interrupt the sorrow that had already filled the road before he arrived. His pace matched theirs with such natural ease that, after a little while, the sound of 3 sets of footsteps seemed to belong together. A faint wind moved through the low shrubs along the path. Somewhere beyond the slope, sheep were being gathered before evening, their distant bleating softened by the hills. The sky above the western ridges had begun to deepen into gold, while Jerusalem, behind them, held the last brightness of the day like a city that had witnessed too much and had not yet understood what it had seen. Cleopas walked with his head slightly lowered. His companion kept close beside him, sometimes glancing at the stranger, sometimes looking toward the road ahead. They had been speaking intensely before he came near, and even now their silence was not empty. It was crowded with questions, with remembered faces, with the noise of a crowd, with the sight of a cross outside the city walls. It was the kind of silence that follows when words have been used all day and still have not been enough. Then the traveler spoke. "What is this conversation that you are holding with each other as you walk?" The question was simple. It carried no accusation. It came like the lifting of a curtain, allowing what had been hidden inside them to stand in the open. Yet at the sound of it, both men stopped. The road itself seemed to pause with them. A small cloud of dust settled near their feet. The olive branches on the slope stirred faintly, silver-green leaves turning in the fading light. Cleopas looked at the stranger, and in his face there was not anger, but astonishment, the weary astonishment of someone who cannot imagine how another soul could have passed through these days untouched by them. They stood there, sad-faced, caught between the road behind and the village ahead. Cleopas answered, "Are you the only visitor to Jerusalem who does not know the things that have happened there in these days?" There was something restrained in his words, a sorrow too deep to sharpen into accusation. Jerusalem had been full for the feast. Pilgrims had filled its streets. News had run like fire from courtyard to courtyard. There had been no hiding from it. The arrest in the night, the hurried trial, the governor's sentence, the hill called Golgotha, the darkness at midday, the cry from the cross, the burial before the Sabbath began. To Cleopas, these things were not rumors. They were fresh wounds. And yet this traveler asked as if he had entered the story from outside it. The stranger answered, "What things?" It was a question that opened space. He who walked with them did not seize the telling for himself. He invited them to speak, to gather the broken pieces in their own hands and name them one by one. And though they could not know it yet, the road had become more than a road. It had become a place where grief would be listened to before it was corrected, where confusion would be drawn out before understanding was given. Cleopas took in a slow breath, though the evening air felt thin in his chest. He turned again toward the path and they began walking. The stranger remained beside them, attentive, patient, his face lit now by the amber light that slipped between the uneven hills. Concerning Jesus of Nazareth, Cleopas said. The name itself changed the air around them. Jesus of Nazareth, the teacher whose voice had carried over fields and lake shores, the healer who had touched those others would not touch, the one who had spoken of the kingdom of God as if it were nearer than breath, the prophet mighty in deed and word before God and all the people. Cleopas spoke carefully at first, but the memories pressed forward. This was not a doctrine to him, not an idea recited from a scroll. This was a life he had watched, a hope he had carried, a promise that had seemed to stand upright in the world with hands, eyes, feet, and a voice. He was a prophet mighty in deed and word before God and all the people, Cleopas said, and as he spoke, the road seemed to gather the scenes into itself. There had been villages where the sick were brought at evening and left changed by morning. There had been meals where sinners sat close and did not feel driven away. There had been questions from scribes, whispers from crowds, children lifted into blessing, blind eyes opened, storms stilled, bread broken and multiplied in hungry hands. There had been words that unsettled the proud and lifted the brokenhearted. Words about forgiveness, words about mercy, words about losing life to find it, words about a shepherd seeking what was lost, words that made some tremble and others begin again. The stranger listened. Not once did he correct the tenderness in Cleopas' voice. Not once did he interrupt the struggle as it found language. His presence beside them was quiet enough that the men continued to unfold the story, yet strong enough that something in them kept speaking. There was a reason this road had grown silent before he arrived, and there was a reason it was beginning to speak again now. Cleopas continued, and how our chief priests and rulers delivered him up to be condemned to death and crucified him. The words fell more heavily than the dust beneath their sandals. The path narrowed for a stretch between low stone walls where small terraces held olive trees rooted in patient earth. Their trunks were twisted and dark, shaped by years of wind and sun, while their leaves caught the dimming light like small pieces of worn silver. The three travelers passed beneath them, and for a moment the branches overhead made broken patterns across their robes. Condemned, crucified. Cleopas did not need to describe every detail. Some memories are too sharp to be held long in speech. Yet the silence around those words carried the rest. The place outside the walls, the soldiers, the watching crowd, the mockery, the nails, the sign above his head. The hours when those who loved him could do nothing but stand at a distance and endure what they could not stop. The weight of it had followed them out of Jerusalem, and now it walked beside them like a shadow. His companion spoke then, voice low, as if adding what Cleopas could not bear to say alone. But we had hoped that he was the one to redeem Israel. We had hoped. There it was, the wound beneath all the words. Not only that Jesus had died, though that grief was deep enough. Not only that he had suffered, though that memory could break the heart. But that hope itself had seemed to die with him. They had looked at him and believed that the long story of their people was nearing its great turning. Israel, burdened by foreign rule, aching under the memory of exile and promise, waiting for consolation, waiting for redemption. The scriptures had been read in synagogues. The Psalms had been sung at feasts. Prophets had spoken of a coming one, a king, a servant, a light, a shepherd, a branch from the root of Jesse. And in Jesus they had dared to think the waiting was ending. But the one they trusted had been buried. The road opened again, and the hills beyond Emmaus lay in the distance, softened by the approach of evening. Smoke rose thinly from scattered homes far ahead, blue-gray against the warm sky. A farmer was leading an animal down from a field. Birds crossed low over the path and disappeared into the darkening line of trees. Life continued around them with almost unbearable ordinary calm. Cleopa's voice grew quieter. Yes, and besides all this, it is now the third day since these things happened. The third day. He said it as a man holding a phrase he did not yet know how to understand. The third day had weight in Israel's memory. It was not an empty measure of time. It echoed faintly with stories of deliverance, of testing, of God acting when human strength had run out. Yet for Cleopas, that day had nearly passed. The sun was lowering. The village was closer. The tomb had been sealed in his thoughts as firmly as it had been sealed in stone. And still there was the strange report. Moreover, he said, and now uncertainty entered his tone, some women of our company amazed us. The stranger's face remained turned toward him. They were at the tomb early in the morning, Cleopas continued. And when they did not find his body, they came back saying that they had even seen a vision of angels who said that he was alive. The words seemed to hover over the road, fragile as the first blue of evening gathering beneath the gold. The women had gone before sunrise, carrying spices, carrying love, carrying the practical devotion of those who still serve when dreams have collapsed. They had expected a sealed tomb, a body, a final act of honor. Instead, they returned breathless, shaken, speaking of a stone moved away, of no body inside, of messengers in dazzling brightness, of words that sounded too vast for grief to receive. He is alive. The report had amazed them, but amazement is not the same as belief. Wonder can stand at the threshold and still be afraid to enter. Cleopas and his companion had heard the women. They had seen the urgency in their faces. They had listened as others in their company tried to piece it together. Could grief make visions? Could fear confuse the mind? Could enemies have taken the body? Could angels truly have spoken? Every possibility had risen and fallen before them, and none had brought them the one thing they needed most, the sight of Jesus himself. Some of those who were with us went to the tomb, Cleopas added, and found it just as the women had said, but him they did not see. But him they did not see. The final words were spoken with the ache of the whole journey. They had reports, they had absence, they had an empty place where certainty should have been. The stone was moved, the body was gone, the women were amazed, the others confirmed what they could confirm. But the Lord they loved had not stood before them. No familiar voice had called their names. No wounded hands had reached toward them. No explanation had been given that could gather cross, tomb, prophecy, and promise into one meaning. And so they walked away, not because they had ceased to love him, not because they had forgotten his words, but because their hearts could not yet hold the possibility that God's redemption had passed through death and come out the other side. They were leaving Jerusalem with the story unfinished, unaware that the very one they mourned was listening to them speak of him. The traveler walked on beside them. The sun slipped lower, and the color of the road changed. The dust that had been pale in afternoon became bronze, then muted brown. The olive groves deepened into shadow. The air smelled faintly of crushed thyme beneath their sandals, of dry earth cooling, of smoke from evening fires beginning to rise from homes not yet seen. The world was preparing for night, drawing its edges inward. Cleopas looked again at the stranger. There was something about him he could not name. He had asked as though he did not know, yet he listened as though every word mattered. He seemed both unfamiliar and strangely near, like a line from scripture remembered before its meaning was clear. The companion beside Cleopas felt it too, though neither spoke of it. The stranger had allowed them to pour out the broken account, and now the road seemed to wait for his answer. For a few moments, only their footsteps sounded. Then the traveler began to speak. His voice did not rise. It did not break the evening open with force. It entered the fading day with steady authority, calm enough for weary men to receive, yet carrying a depth that made the ancient hills seem to listen. And before they reached the village, before bread would be taken into his hands, before their eyes would know what their hearts had begun to feel, he would turn them back to the scriptures they thought they knew. But first, he answered their sorrow on the road. The traveler walked with them as the road bent between low stone walls and patches of spring grass, where the last warmth of the day clung to the earth. Behind them, Jerusalem sat upon its hills, no longer bright with festival movement, but dimming beneath the weight of what had happened there. Ahead of them, Emmaus waited somewhere beyond the folds of land, its houses not yet visible, its lamps not yet lit. Between the city and the village, between sorrow and shelter, the three men moved under a sky slowly changing from gold to blue. Cleopas had spoken with the raw honesty of a man whose hope had been wounded. The other disciple had added little, but his silence carried its own testimony. They had believed Jesus of Nazareth was the one to redeem Israel. They had seen his works. They had heard his teaching. They had watched people gather to him as thirsty ground receives rain. And then they had seen the leaders deliver him up, and the Roman soldiers fasten him to wood, and the breath leave his body before the Sabbath came. Their minds could not join these things together. A prophet mighty in deed and word before God, and all the people should not have ended beneath a sentence of shame. The one they hoped would restore Israel should not have been sealed inside a tomb. The story had seemed to rise toward fulfillment, and then, at the very place where victory should have appeared, it had fallen into darkness. The traveler listened until their words had emptied themselves onto the road. Then he spoke. "O foolish ones," he said, "and slow of heart to believe all that the prophets have spoken." The words were firm, but not cruel. They did not strike like stones. They came like a hand turning a face gently back toward the light. The two disciples looked at him as they walked. Perhaps they expected correction for having hoped too much. Perhaps they expected him to say that redemption had been a mistaken dream, that the age remained as it had always been, that Rome still ruled, the priests still guarded their place, and the poor still waited under the same heavy sky. But that was not what he said. Was it not necessary, the traveler continued, that the Christ should suffer these things and enter into his glory? The road seemed to grow more spacious around that question. Necessary, suffer, glory. Three words they had never known how to hold together. They had thought glory would arrive by avoiding suffering, by overcoming enemies in open strength, by casting down the proud and lifting Israel before the nations. Yet the stranger spoke as though the suffering itself had not been an interruption, but a path, not a failure of promise, but the very road by which promise had come near. And before the evening was finished, he would show them that this road had been marked long before their feet touched it. Beginning with Moses, he opened the scriptures to them. He did not hurry. He did not throw words ahead of them as though the truth were something to be seized quickly before night fell. He walked at their pace, letting the ancient story rise around them. The sound of their sandals on dust and stone became the rhythm beneath his teaching. A bird called once from a fig tree and then grew silent. Far off, someone led an animal home before dark. The hills gathered the deepening blue of evening, and the words of the law and the prophets began to unfold beside them. He spoke of the beginning, when God made the world good, and the first man and woman walked among trees planted by the Lord. He spoke of the voice of the serpent, of trust broken, of hiding among leaves, of the sorrow that entered the ground. The disciples knew the story. Every child of Israel knew the story. But the traveler drew their attention to the promise spoken even there, in the place of judgment, that the seed of the woman would bruise the serpent's head, though his own heel would be struck. Cleopas listened more carefully. He had heard that promise before, perhaps many times in synagogue reading, in the instruction of elders, in the old cadences of teaching passed from father to son. Yet on this road after the cross, the words took on a weight he had never felt. A bruised heel, a crushed serpent, wounding and victory in the same promise. Pain and triumph bound together at the root of the story. The traveler went on. He spoke of Abraham, called out from his father's house beneath unfamiliar skies, receiving a promise that all nations would be blessed through his offspring. He spoke of Isaac, the beloved son, carrying wood up the mountain while his father walked beside him with a sorrow no one else could understand. He spoke of the question Isaac asked, simple and piercing, "Where is the lamb for the offering?" And he spoke of Abraham's answer, that God himself would provide the lamb. The two disciples did not interrupt. The road before them had become more than a road. The stones and shadows seemed to hold memory. The evening wind moved through the grass, and with it came the faint scent of olive leaves and dry earth. As the traveler spoke, the ancient mountain rose in their imagination. The beloved son, the wood, the lifted knife, the substitute caught in the thicket, the Lord providing, the place named in hope. On the mount of the Lord it shall be provided. The words hovered, not loudly, but with a strange nearness. Then he spoke of the night of Passover and the houses of Israel in Egypt, their doorposts marked with blood while judgment passed through the land. He described the lamb without blemish, the meal eaten in readiness, the sandals on their feet, the staff in hand, the bitter herbs, the unleavened bread, the people waiting for deliverance while darkness lay over Egypt. The disciples knew this too. They had just been in Jerusalem for the feast. They had eaten Passover with trembling memories of Moses and Pharaoh, of slavery and the sea. But now the travelers' words made the familiar feast feel newly alive. A lamb slain, blood that sheltered, a people brought out not by their own strength, but by the mighty hand of God. Deliverance beginning in the night, before the road through the waters had opened. Salvation marked by sacrifice before freedom was fully seen. The other disciple felt something stir within him, though he did not yet name it. It was not happiness. His grief had not vanished. The image of the crucifixion still remained in him, and the sealed tomb still stood in his mind like a stone no hand could move. But beneath those memories, another pattern began to appear. It was faint at first, like the first lamp lit in a distant house. What had seemed senseless might have been held inside a larger design. The traveler did not soften the suffering. He did not pretend blood was not blood, or anguish not anguish, or death not death. Instead, he showed them that the God of Israel had never told his story as though glory were untouched by sorrow. The Lord had always entered the place of bondage to redeem. He had always heard groaning. He had always made a way where no way could be seen. And slowly, as the blue of evening deepened, their sadness began to receive meaning. He spoke of the wilderness where Israel walked under cloud and fire, not yet home, not yet steady, often afraid, often resistant. He spoke of bread from heaven, given morning by morning enough for the day. He spoke of water from the rock, struck so that the thirsty people might live. He spoke of the bronze serpent lifted up in the camp, so that those bitten by death could look and be spared. Each story was known to them, yet each one now seemed to carry a hidden flame, bread given from above, living water where there had been stone, a sign lifted up before dying eyes. The traveler wove them together without haste, not as riddles meant to confuse, but as threads meant to reveal. The disciples had thought the Messiah's suffering contradicted Scripture. The stranger was showing them that Scripture had been moving toward a Messiah whose suffering would be the doorway into glory. There was a reason their hearts had not been able to let go of Jesus, even after they had seen him die. There was a reason his words had remained within them when other voices faded. There was a reason the women's report had unsettled them so deeply that morning, even though they had not known how to believe it. The promise had been nearer than their understanding. The road narrowed for a while, descending into a shallow place between slopes. The air cooled there. Shadows gathered under the branches of small trees, and the stones underfoot held the day's warmth only in traces. The traveler's face was partly turned from them as he walked, his features softened by the blue-gray light. He seemed like any pilgrim returning from the feast, yet his words made the Torah breathe around them. Then he spoke of David. He spoke of the shepherd king anointed in Bethlehem, overlooked by men but chosen by God. He spoke of songs written in caves, in palaces, in danger, in repentance, in longing. He recalled the psalm of the righteous sufferer, surrounded by mockers, hands and feet pierced, garments divided, lots cast for clothing. Cleopas swallowed and looked down at the road. Those words had been sung before. They had belonged to the prayers of Israel. But now the memory of Golgotha rose beside them with painful clarity. Mockers, divided garments, pierced hands and feet. He wanted to turn away from the comparison, yet he could not. The traveler's voice remained steady. He spoke also of the psalm where the Lord would not abandon his Holy One to corruption, nor let his faithful one see decay. He spoke of the stone rejected by the builders becoming the cornerstone. He spoke of the king to whom the Lord said, "Sit at my right hand," until every enemy would be placed beneath his feet. The disciples listened as men listening not only with ears, but with wounds. Their sorrow had been full of unanswered questions. Why had God allowed this? Why had Jesus not resisted? Why had the rulers prevailed? Why had the sign of redemption become an instrument of shame? But the traveler did not answer by explaining every moment of pain. He answered by showing that the Holy One of Israel had spoken beforehand. The suffering of the Messiah was not outside the covenant. It was written into the deep places of God's saving purpose. Yet this made another question rise, softer and more searching than the first. If this was true, if the scriptures had pointed toward suffering and then glory, then what had they failed to see while walking with Jesus? What had he said that they had heard but not understood? What warnings had seemed too sorrowful to accept? What promises had sounded too impossible to believe? The road was growing dimmer now. The fields no longer shone. They held the low colors of evening, olive, brown, and silver fading into one another. A few early lamps appeared far away near scattered homes. Somewhere a gate creaked. Somewhere a child's voice called and was answered. The ordinary life of the land continued, as it had on the morning they buried him, as it had while the women went to the tomb, as it had while angels spoke words too large for grief to carry. The traveler continued with the prophets. He spoke of Isaiah, who had seen the Lord high and lifted up, and who had also spoken of a servant despised and rejected by men, a man of sorrows acquainted with grief. He spoke of one who carried the wounds of others, who was pierced for transgressions, crushed for iniquities, upon whom the chastisement bringing wholeness was laid. like a lamb led to the slaughter, silent before those who judged him, cut off from the land of the living, yet afterward seeing the fruit of his suffering. The two disciples slowed without realizing it. These were not unfamiliar words, but now they came toward them like a lamp brought into a room they had kept closed, despised, rejected, pierced, silent, cut off, and yet not abandoned to emptiness. The servant's suffering was not meaningless. It bore something. It carried something. It healed something. It opened a future beyond death. The other disciple felt his chest tighten, not with fear, but with recognition he could not yet speak. The crucifixion had seemed to prove that Jesus was not the one. But what if it had revealed him? What if the shame they had witnessed was the very place where God was doing what no sword, no uprising, no earthly throne could accomplish? What if redemption had been unfolding while they thought redemption had been lost? The traveler moved from prophet to prophet, from promise to promise, with the calm of one walking through a house he knew well. He spoke of Jeremiah's new covenant, of law written not only on stone but within the heart. He spoke of Ezekiel's promise of a clean heart and a new spirit, of dry bones brought together and raised by the breath of God. He spoke of Daniel's Son of Man receiving dominion that would not pass away. He spoke of Zechariah's king, humble and riding on a donkey, and of the pierced one upon whom the people would look with mourning. The disciples had seen Jesus enter Jerusalem on a donkey. They had heard the crowds cry out. They had watched the same city turn heavy with accusation. They had seen piercing. They had known mourning. And now, on a road growing dark, the scriptures stood around these memories like witnesses. The traveler was not adding something foreign to their faith. He was gathering the scattered pieces of Israel's hope and placing them before their eyes. The promise to Eve, the ram for Isaac, the Passover lamb, the bread in the wilderness, the lifted sign of healing, the suffering righteous one, the rejected stone, the servant pierced and yet victorious, the new covenant, the shepherd struck, the humble king, the everlasting kingdom. Everything they had thought broken was beginning to appear as part of one vast mercy. Still, they did not know him. Their eyes remained held. They walked beside the Lord and listened to him explain the Lord's ways, but recognition had not yet opened. And perhaps there was mercy even in that. For if they had known at once, their joy might have overcome their hearing. If they had seen him immediately, they might have clung to the wonder and missed the meaning. So he gave them the scriptures before he gave them the sight. He let their hearts awaken slowly, not by spectacle, but by the word of God burning through confusion. The evening grew cooler. The last amber vanished from the western hills. Blue settled into the hollows. The road's pale dust looked almost silver now, and their figures moved through it like men walking inside a remembered prayer. Cleopas no longer spoke of defeat. The other disciple no longer stared only at the ground. They looked toward the traveler, then toward the road, then toward one another, as though each feared to interrupt what was happening by naming it too soon. Something within them was changing, not the facts. The cross had happened. The tomb had been sealed. The women had come with strange news. Their friends had been confused. Jerusalem was still behind them, heavy with all they had seen. But the meaning of those facts was being transformed. The suffering no longer stood alone. The darkness was not the end of the sentence. The promises of God had not collapsed beneath human violence. They had passed through it. And before they reached Emmaus, before the lamps of the village drew them in, before bread would be broken at a table, the two disciples carried within them a new and trembling possibility. Maybe the story had not ended in the tomb. Maybe the scriptures had been preparing them for this very hour. Maybe the redemption they hoped for had come in a form deeper than conquest, quieter than triumphal display, more costly than they had imagined. and nearer than their own footsteps on the road. The traveler kept walking with them. His voice settled into the evening like a flame protected from wind. And as he spoke, their grief did not disappear all at once, but it was no longer alone. Meaning had entered it. Promise had entered it. The God of Abraham, Isaac, Jacob, Moses, David, and the prophets had been at work through generations, through signs and songs and sacrifices, through kings and exiles and whispered hopes, all leading toward a mystery the two disciples had nearly missed. The village was not far now. The road lifted slightly, and beyond the darkening fields, the first shapes of Emmaus began to appear against the fading sky. Low roofs, stone walls, a place to stop before night fully covered the land. Yet neither disciple felt ready for the traveler to leave. The words he had spoken still moved within them, warming places grief had made cold. There was more they longed to hear, though they could not yet say why. There was something in his presence that made the ancient promises feel not only explained, but alive. And as the road entered the edge of the village, the question that had followed them from Jerusalem changed. It was no longer only, why did he die? It had become, who is this stranger who makes the suffering of the Messiah sound like the faithfulness of God? The answer was near, but not yet spoken. By the time they reached Emmaus, the evening had deepened upon the hills. The road, which had carried their questions mile after mile from Jerusalem, now narrowed toward the village. Stone walls rose beside small gardens. Olive trees leaned in the dimming light, their silver leaves no longer bright but soft and blue against the descending dusk. A few lamps had begun to appear in doorways. Thin threads of smoke lifted from low roofs where evening fires were being coaxed back to life. Somewhere nearby, a goat bleated once, and farther off, a child's voice was called indoors before night covered the lanes. The two disciples slowed as they came among the houses. Their feet knew the weariness of the journey. Dust clung to their sandals and the hems of their garments. Their shoulders carried the heaviness of sorrow, but not as before. Something had changed on the road. Their grief had not disappeared, and the questions had not all been answered in the way they expected. But the stranger's words had entered them like a flame sheltered from the wind. The scriptures had become a road beneath the road. They had left Jerusalem thinking only of loss, but he had spoken of Moses, of the prophets, of promises carried through generations, and he had drawn their eyes toward a pattern they had not seen. The suffering they had feared was defeat had been shown to them as something foreknown, something held within the purpose of God. The Messiah's pain had not been outside the story. It had been woven into the very heart of it. And now, as the village gathered itself for night, the stranger appeared to continue farther. It was a small movement. He did not announce it. He did not test them with dramatic words. As they reached the place where they would turn aside, he walked as though his path stretched on beyond Emmaus, out into the darkening country. The road continued past the village, bending toward the open hills, where the last glow of the western sky faded behind the ridges. The two men noticed at once. After all they had heard, the thought of letting him go into the night felt suddenly unbearable, not because they fully understood him, not because they knew his name, but because his presence had become the one clear thing in a day of confusion. The road behind them, once full of broken hope, now seemed marked by hidden mercy, and something within them knew that if he passed on, the night would feel emptier than before. One of them stepped closer and urged him, saying, "Stay with us, for it is toward evening and the day is far spent." The words were simple hospitality, the kind expected among the people of Israel. No traveler should be left to wander unnecessarily after dark. The roads could be uncertain, and the night could make even familiar paths seem strange. But beneath the courtesy was something deeper. They were not only offering shelter, they were asking the voice that had opened the scriptures to remain a little longer. The other disciple joined the invitation, and together they pressed him kindly. Their tone was not demanding but earnest. "Stay with us. Come in from the road. Share what little we have. Let the night find us under one roof." And the stranger turned aside with them. No trumpet sounded in that turning. No sign appeared over the lintel. The village did not know that history was drawing near to a table. The neighbors went on tending lamps and closing doors. The hills settled into shadow. Yet in that small act of welcomed companionship, the moment prepared by God moved closer to its appointed unveiling. They entered a simple home, or perhaps a common room where travelers could be received. The space was modest, shaped by the needs of daily life. The floor was hard-packed and swept clean. A low table or mat was set where bread could be placed. A small oil lamp was lit, its flame wavering at first, then steadying into a warm circle of light. Clay vessels stood along the wall. The scent of baked grain lingered in the room, mingled with oil, dust, and the faint smoke of the lamp. Outside, Emmaus grew darker. Inside, the three reclined together. The disciples moved with the quiet attentiveness of hosts who have little but give it freely. Perhaps water was offered for dusty hands, perhaps a piece of bread, a small portion of food, something plain and enough for evening. Their gestures were familiar, ordinary, almost unnoticed. They had shared meals before. They had broken bread on many nights across many villages. But there are moments when God hides glory inside what is most common, so that the heart may learn where to look. The stranger sat with them in the lamplight. His face, shadowed and warm, must have seemed both near and impossible to fully grasp. They had walked with him for hours. They had heard him unfold the scriptures with an authority unlike the scribes, not heavy with display but complete, as though he spoke from within the story itself. Their hearts had stirred, yet their eyes remained held. They had not recognized him on the road. They had not known the one who spoke of the Messiah's suffering was himself the crucified and risen Lord. But something was drawing to its appointed moment. At the table, the roles quietly shifted. The disciples had invited him as a guest. He had come under their roof by their urging. Yet when bread was set before them, he did what the head of the table would do. Without asking permission, without making explanation, he took the bread into his hands. The lamp flame trembled. Perhaps both disciples looked up. There was nothing theatrical in the movement. A loaf was lifted. Hands held it. The room remained small. The walls did not expand. The night did not burst into brightness. And yet in that gesture, memory began to gather. They had seen hands take bread before. They had known the way their master gave thanks. They had watched him feed crowds in lonely places. They had sat with him when bread was blessed and shared. Some memories rise not by command, but by recognition deeper than thought. He blessed it. The blessing was likely the ancient gratitude of Israel, giving thanks to the God who brings forth bread from the earth. Words spoken over common food, lifted toward the Father who sustains the living. Yet from his mouth, the blessing carried the fullness of a life given wholly to God. It was not merely custom, it was communion. It was the Son blessing the Father's gift, the risen one giving thanks in a room where sorrow had followed him unknowingly from Jerusalem. Then he broke it. The sound was small, bread parting in his hands, a quiet tear of crust and crumb. Yet in that sound the whole road seemed to gather, Moses and the prophets, the suffering and the glory, the cross and the empty tomb, the women at dawn, the angel's message, the promise that had seemed impossible, the hidden thread running through every word he had spoken while evening fell. He gave it to them, and their eyes were opened. In a single instant the veil lifted. The stranger was not a stranger, it was Jesus, not merely remembered, not imagined through grief, not present as a comforting thought only. Jesus himself, the one who had been delivered up, the one whose body had hung upon the cross, the one laid in the tomb, the one they thought they had lost beyond all hope. He was there at the table in Emmaus, alive, known in the breaking of the bread. The room must have become immeasurably full, though nothing in it outwardly changed. The lamp still burned. The clay vessels still stood along the wall. The bread remained between them, but the world had turned upon its hinge. The story they thought had ended in darkness had opened into a dawn they had not known how to believe. Their breath may have caught. Their hands may have stilled above the table. Every word from the road came alive at once. The rebuke that had not wounded but awakened them. The scriptures opening like doors. The suffering Messiah entering his glory. Their hearts, which had burned while he spoke, now understood the fire. It had been him all along. He had walked with them in their confusion. He had listened before correcting. He had asked their sorrow to speak. He had not rushed their understanding, but had carried them through the scriptures step by step, promise by promise, until they could arrive at this table prepared to see. And as soon as they recognized him, he vanished from their sight. One moment he was there. The next he was no longer visible. No door opened. No footsteps crossed the threshold. No farewell was spoken. The place where he had reclined was empty, yet not empty. His absence was unlike the absence of death. It did not crush them back into despair. It left behind a presence more certain than sight. The bread remained. The blessing lingered. The truth stood before them, clearer than the lamp flame. They had seen the Lord. For a moment, perhaps neither man spoke. The room held the wonder with them. Outside, night settled fully over Emmaus. The lanes grew dark. The village quieted behind closed doors. But inside, the disciples were no longer the men who had arrived with dimmed faces and burdened steps. Their sorrow had been met, not by explanation alone, but by revelation. Then one said to the other, "Did not our heart burn within us while he talked with us by the way, and while he opened to us the scriptures?" The question did not need an answer, and yet it answered everything. Yes, their hearts had burned, not with restless fear, not with the fever of confusion, with the living warmth of truth recognized before the mind could name it. Something within them had known that his words carried life. Something had awakened while he spoke of the law and the prophets, while he showed that the Christ ought to suffer these things and enter into his glory. The burning had been the witness of their hearts before their eyes were opened. Now they understood. The road had not merely been a walk away from Jerusalem. It had been the mercy of God drawing near to two discouraged disciples and turning them around from within. The village had not been only an end point. It had become the place of unveiling. The table had not been ordinary after all. It had become the threshold where grief gave way to testimony. Their earlier words must have returned to them with new meaning. We had hoped. They had spoken in the past tense, as if hope belonged behind them. But hope had been walking beside them, patient enough to hear their pain, faithful enough to open the scriptures, near enough to take bread in his hands. And now the question that filled the room was no longer whether the women's report could be true. It was what they must do with the truth now burning inside them. Night lay over the road they had just traveled. The distance back to Jerusalem was not small. The hills were dark. Their bodies were tired from the day's journey. Any sensible traveler would wait until morning. But revelation has its own strength. Some news cannot sleep until it has been carried to those who need it. The bread still lay broken. The lamp still shone low upon the table. The place where Jesus had vanished remained before them like a silent sign. They had urged him to stay because the day was far spent. Now, because he had made himself known, they could not stay where they were. They rose that same hour. The house that had received them became the place from which they departed. Emmaus, which had seemed like an ending, became the beginning of their return. They gathered themselves quickly, no longer dragged by disappointment but drawn by witness. The night outside had not changed, but they had. The road would be the same road, yet it would not feel the same beneath their feet, for they had gone out with sorrow. They would return with testimony. They had left Jerusalem saying what they did not understand. They would go back saying what they had seen. And somewhere beyond the dark hills, the other disciples waited behind closed doors, carrying their own fears, their own fragments of news, their own trembling questions. Before the night was over, those two travelers would step back into the place of mourning with a message that could not remain hidden. The Lord was risen indeed, and he had been known to them in the breaking of the bread. They rose from the table as men awakened from a deep place, though the room around them had not changed. The lamp still burned with its small flame. The bread still lay opened where his hands had broken it. The shadows still leaned against the walls of the house in Emmaus. Outside, the village had settled into night. Doors were closed. Cooking fires had lowered to embers. Families had gathered beneath their roofs, and the road beyond the threshold had turned dark between the stones. But nothing inside Cleopas and his companion was the same. A moment before, they had been hosts offering shelter to a traveler. Then the bread had been taken, blessed, broken, and given. Then their eyes had opened, and in that opening the stranger was no stranger. The wounded hope they had carried from Jerusalem had been met by the living Lord himself. He had vanished from their sight, but he had not vanished from the meaning of what had happened. If anything, his absence made the room brighter in a way the lamp could not explain. They looked at one another, and the silence between them was no longer confusion. It was recognition trying to find words. "Did not our heart burn within us," they said, "while he talked with us by the way and while he opened to us the scriptures?" The question did not need an answer. It gathered the whole road into one sentence. The long walk, the sorrow, the rebuke that had not crushed them, the scriptures unfolding from Moses and all the prophets, the strange warmth that had stirred beneath their grief before they knew its source. They understood now that the fire had begun before the bread. The revelation at the table had not appeared without preparation. All evening he had been drawing near, not only to their steps but to their understanding. And before the night could grow older, they knew what they must do. Jerusalem was miles away. The road was difficult by daylight and more dangerous after dark. The hills were uneven. The paths could be lonely. The city they had left behind still held the place of crucifixion, the memory of fear, the closed rooms where disciples whispered and wondered. It would have been reasonable to wait until morning. No one would have blamed them for staying in Emmaus until the first pale line appeared over the eastern ridge. But the news inside them would not sleep. They had walked away carrying disappointment. Now they would return carrying witness. The same road that had received their slow steps in sorrow would feel their urgent steps in the dark. Not a loud urgency, not a reckless one, but the solemn strength that comes when God has placed truth in the hands of ordinary people. They wrapped their garments close, stepped from the house, and entered the night. The air outside was cooler now. The warmth of evening had drained from the stones. The village lay behind them in muted shapes, roofs and walls folded into shadow. Somewhere an animal shifted in its pen. A faint thread of smoke lifted from a dying fire. The road opened before them, silvered in places where the moon touched the ground, swallowed in darkness where the olive trees bent over it. They had come this way with heavy hearts, speaking of all that had happened. Now they moved through the same hills with the memory of his voice still alive within them. Every turn of the path seemed changed, though the earth itself remained the same. A stone where one of them had paused in grief. a slope where the stranger had begun to speak of the prophets, a narrow bend where their own despair had sounded so certain. All of it now belonged to another story. There was a reason the road had grown silent around them earlier. There was a reason their eyes had been held. Had they known him too soon, perhaps they would have clung only to the sight of him. But he had first led them through the word, showing that the cross had not been the end of God's promise, but the very road by which the promise entered glory. He had taught them before he revealed himself. He had opened the scriptures before he opened their eyes, and as they walked back beneath the deepening night, they carried both. The path climbed, their sandals pressed into dust and loose stone. The darker the road became, the clearer their remembrance grew. They could hear again the way he had spoken of suffering, not as defeat, but as fulfillment. They could hear him gathering scattered passages into one great testimony: the bruised heel, the promised seed, the Passover lamb, the servant wounded and yet not abandoned, the righteous one whose soul would not be left to corruption, the king whose throne would not fail. These were no longer distant texts recited in synagogue or remembered in fragments. They had become a living pattern, and at the center of that pattern was the one who had walked beside them with dust on his feet. From time to time, they may have spoken to each other in brief phrases, because the night asked for care. Perhaps one would say, "Here, the path narrows." Perhaps the other would answer, "I remember this place." Yet beneath those practical words, another speech continued within them. Their hearts were now telling the journey back to itself. We were not abandoned. We were not walking alone. We did not recognize him, but he knew us. The hills between Emmaus and Jerusalem had witnessed many travelers, pilgrims going up to feasts, merchants with packs, families, soldiers, mourners, worshippers. That night, they witnessed two disciples returning with a message the world could not produce and death could not silence. Their steps were small against the land, but the truth they carried was vast. The Lord who had been crucified was alive. As they neared Jerusalem, the city rose dark and solemn against the night. Its walls held the day's memories within them. The crowded streets, the temple courts, the rumors that had spread since morning, the fear of authorities, the astonishment of women whose testimony had seemed too much to grasp. The city did not yet look like a place transformed. It looked as it had looked before, stone upon stone, gates shadowed, rooftops dim beneath the sky. But the disciples approaching it knew that heaven had already entered its sorrow. They found their way through the familiar paths toward the place where the others were gathered. The streets were subdued. Doors remained shut. The sound of their steps seemed louder in the narrow ways. They were not returning to an open celebration, but to a room still marked by uncertainty. And before they entered, there may have been one small moment when the memory of their earlier grief passed before them like a shadow already fading. They had left because they could not make sense of the cross. They returned because the risen Christ had made sense of it in their presence. At last they reached the house. Inside were the 11 and those with them, gathered together. The room held the weight of people who had heard reports too wonderful to dismiss and too overwhelming to understand. Faces turned when the two entered. Their arrival at such an hour would have drawn attention at once. But before Cleopas and his companion could pour out the whole account, they were met by words already rising in the room. "The Lord is risen indeed, and hath appeared to Simon." The witness was not theirs alone. That sentence must have met them like another lamp being lit. What had happened in Emmaus was part of something larger already moving among the disciples. The risen Lord had not revealed himself to only one road, one table, one pair of grieving travelers. He was gathering his scattered followers by mercy, meeting them in the places where sorrow had left them. To Mary in the garden, to Simon, to the two on the road, to those who waited behind doors. The testimony was becoming a chorus, not by force but by encounter. Then the two told what had happened on the way. They spoke of the stranger who drew near while they reasoned together. They confessed how their eyes had been held, how he had asked about their sorrow, how he had listened to their account of Jesus of Nazareth, mighty in deed and word before God and all the people. They told how they had said with aching honesty that they had trusted it had been he who should redeem Israel. They told of the women at the tomb, of the angels, of the empty place where his body had been laid. And then they told how he answered. They recounted, as best they could, the scriptures he had opened. Perhaps not every word could be remembered in order. Some teachings are too deep to be captured immediately, especially when the teacher is the risen Christ himself. But the meaning had entered them. They could tell the others that he had shown the necessity of the Messiah's suffering and the glory that followed. They could say that the story of God had not broken at Calvary. It had reached the hidden center toward which it had always been moving. Then came the table. They spoke of arriving in the village, of urging him, "Abide with us, for it is toward evening and the day is far spent." They described how he went in to stay with them, how he sat at meat, how he took bread, blessed it, broke it, and gave it to them. How in that act, so simple and so sacred, their eyes were opened, and how he vanished out of their sight. No one in that room could have treated such words lightly. The disciples knew the breaking of bread. They knew the gestures of their master. They knew the authority of blessing in his hands. The two from Emmaus were not describing a dream drifting away at sunrise. They were bearing witness to recognition. They had known him in the breaking of bread. The room, once enclosed by fear, had begun to be enclosed by wonder. Outside, Jerusalem remained under night. The streets did not yet understand what had begun. The temple stones reflected faint traces of darkness. The hill of crucifixion stood where it had stood. The tomb lay open somewhere in the garden, its emptiness speaking without noise. But inside that gathered room, the meaning of the night had changed. Grief was no longer the master of the story. Confusion no longer held the final word. Christ had walked with them before they knew him. He had opened the scriptures before they understood him. He had revealed himself when the bread was broken. And now, as the hour grew late, the road to Emmaus was complete. It had begun as a path of departure, carrying two hearts away from Jerusalem under the weight of disappointed hope. It had become a place of instruction, where the risen Lord joined ordinary footsteps and turned sorrow toward understanding. It had ended at a table where recognition came not through spectacle, but through the familiar grace of his hands. Then it had become a return. That is the quiet mercy at the heart of the story. The Lord did not wait for perfect faith before drawing near. He came to men who were speaking in confusion. He listened to sorrow that did not yet know the whole truth. He corrected without abandoning. He taught with patience. He stayed when invited. He made himself known in a moment humble enough to be missed by the proud, yet clear enough to restore the brokenhearted. The night gathered around the house, deep and wide. Voices lowered. The testimony settled among them like a gift too holy to rush. Perhaps the disciples looked from one face to another, holding the new shape of hope. Perhaps Cleopas and his companion sat at last, their feet tired from the double journey, their souls steadied by what they had seen. The road was behind them now. The table was behind them. But the presence of the risen Lord was no longer behind them, as if he belonged only to one place or 1 hour. He was alive. And because he was alive, Scripture had opened. Suffering had been gathered into glory. Evening had not ended in darkness. The road that seemed to lead away had become the road by which they were brought back. So the story rests there for tonight, in the deep shelter of that upper room, among disciples who are beginning to understand that the crucified Jesus is risen indeed. The lamps burn low. The walls hold the murmured witness. The city sleeps without yet knowing how much has changed, and the two who once walked with downcast faces now sit among their brothers with the truth gently shining within them. They had asked him to abide with them because evening had come, and he had answered in a way greater than they knew. Not only in the house at Emmaus, not only at the table, not only along one road between one village and one city. He abides as the risen Lord who comes near before he is recognized, who speaks through the scriptures before hearts can fully understand, and who makes himself known in grace at the appointed time. The road is dark now. The stones are cooling beneath the night. The hills lie folded between Emmaus and Jerusalem, holding the memory of footsteps that carried sorrow one way and witness the other. The bread is broken. The scriptures are opened. The question has found its answer. The Lord is risen indeed.